It wasn't a machine that told me my sister was dying. It was a pair of shoes. White sneakers, the cheap kind with the reinforced toe that nurses buy in bulk, and they came past the waiting room door at a speed. Those shoes are not designed for. Then another pair, then a cart with a bad wheel. Nobody yelled. That's the part people get wrong about hospitals at 3 in the morning. Nobody yells. The volume goes down, and everything else goes up, and if you have spent any part of your life around emergencies, you feel that inversion in your back teeth before your brain catches up. My name is Wes Bramlett. I'm 46 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia, in the Baldwin Park neighborhood, in a house with a porch that needs work and a live oak out front that will outlive everyone I love. For 19 years, I have worked as a field investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board. I go to places where something came apart. I walk a debris field in a grid pattern, and I write down what I see before I let myself have a single thought about what it means. Here is the thing my job taught me, and I want to say it up front because everything that follows sits on top of it. The biggest piece of wreckage tells you almost nothing. The engine, the fuselage, the twisted rail, those are the loud parts, and the loud parts are consequences. The truth lives somewhere small, a bolt with the wrong thread pitch, a logbook entry made an hour later than it should have been. Something quiet that nobody thought to look at sitting off at the edge of the grid where the grass is still standing. I've reconstructed nights I wasn't present for. I've told families what happened to people they loved based on a torn seatbelt and a fuel receipt. None of it prepared me for standing on the wrong side of a door. My sister's name is Josie. She's 33, 13 years younger than me, which means I was in high school when she was learning to walk. And I taught her to ride a bike in the parking lot of Emmanuel Lutheran on Waters Avenue because our mother was working doubles and our father was running a container crane down at the port, and neither of them had a Saturday to spare. Our mother died when Josie was 19. Our father, Hollis, died 3 years ago in the front room of the same house he bought in 1979, and Josie sat with him for the last 11 days of it and did not once let him see her cry. She's a clinical pharmacist at Chatham Memorial. She knows what every number on a lab panel means, and she can tell you the half-life of anything you can name. She reads the world the way I read a debris field, except she does it faster, and she doesn't have to write it down. She married Grant Kessler 4 years ago. I'm going to be careful about Grant. I'm going to be precise, because precision is the only thing I have to offer here, and because sloppiness in this kind of story is how you end up wrong about somebody. Grant Kessler is 36. He's a wealth manager with an office on Bull Street, 3rd floor, good light, a framed photograph of a sailboat he doesn't own. He wears the watch, he remembers your kids' names. He asks you a follow-up question, and he listens to the answer with his whole face. The first time I met him, at a barbecue at my house, he about the job. Not the way people usually ask, which is what's the worst one you've seen. He asked how I keep the family members away from the site. He asked what I do with the personal effects. He asked whether I ever tell them the truth about how long it took. I remember thinking, this man is very good at this. And I remember later that night standing at the grill after everybody had gone inside, thinking a second thing that I did not say to anyone for 4 years. Good at what, exactly? My wife, Simone, she teaches choir at Windsor Forest High, has for 20 years, and she can hear a kid faking the words from the back row. Simone said something to me last October while we were washing dishes. She said it the way she says things she'd rather be wrong about. She said Josie had mentioned a name twice in one conversation without noticing she'd done it. A woman at Grant's office. Delaney. Simone said, twice, Wes, and the second time she changed her voice. I put that in a drawer in my head. I did not open the drawer. That is a decision I have thought about approximately 9,000 times since. Josie got pregnant last spring, 32 years old, healthy, a runner. The kind of person who reads the entire packet the OB gives you, and then reads the citations at the back. She had a boy in there. At the 20-week anatomy scan, the ultrasound tech spent 40 minutes trying to get him to turn, and he wouldn't. He stayed curled up with both hands over his face, knees tucked like a man asleep in a chair he doesn't want to be woken up from. The tech laughed and said, he's hiding. Josie put her hand flat on her stomach and didn't say anything. The pregnancy was uncomplicated for 34 weeks and 6 days. I want that on the record, because later a lot of people would ask why nobody did anything sooner, and the answer is that there was nothing to do. Her blood pressure was normal. Her labs were clean. She went to every appointment. She cut out coffee, which for Josie was roughly equivalent to cutting off a hand. On a Tuesday in early February, she woke up at 4 in the morning with pain under her right ribs that she thought was heartburn. She took an antacid. She went back to sleep. At 6 she got up, made oatmeal, and threw it up. At 7:15 she called her OB's office, and because she is who she is, she also logged into the hospital's employee portal and pulled up her own labs from a draw she'd had 2 days earlier as part of a routine check. She looked at her platelet count. Then she looked at her liver enzymes. She called her doctor back and said, "I think this is Hell P." She was right. I'm going to explain this once and then leave it alone, because I've since had to explain it to about 40 relatives and I've watched every one of them go through the same phase. Hell P syndrome is a variant of severe preeclampsia, hemolysis, elevated liver enzymes, low platelets. Your blood starts destroying itself, your liver swells, and your ability to clot falls off a cliff. It can go from nothing to catastrophe in 6 hours. There is no drug that fixes it. There is no waiting it out. The only cure is delivery. Her OB was Dr. Amara Beckett, 49, maternal fetal medicine, 22 years at Chatham Memorial. She wore reading glasses on a chain, which I found oddly comforting, and she had the specific stillness of a person who has stopped performing calm and simply has it. She told Josie to come in immediately. Not tomorrow, not this afternoon. Get in the car. Josie was admitted at 11:52 that night after a day of labs that got worse every 4 hours. Grant drove her. He called me at 12:14 a.m. I want to tell you exactly what he said, because I have replayed it more times than I've replayed anything in my life, including a cockpit voice recorder I once listened to for 11 straight hours. He said, "Hey, don't panic, they've got her stable. They're just watching numbers." 12 words in, and he had already told me not to panic and told me she was stable. Nobody says don't panic unless they've already decided what your reaction is going to be and would prefer a different one. Simone was in the car before I found my keys. We got to Chatham Memorial at 12:36. Labor and delivery is on the 4th floor. The east wing and the corridor outside it has a bank of vending machines and a window that looks out over the employee parking garage. Grant was standing at that window, not in the hallway with his back to the glass, phone at his ear, his free hand pressed flat against the wall, beside him at shoulder height, the way a man braces himself in a doorway during a tremor. He saw us. He lowered the phone in a single smooth motion and put it face down in his jacket pocket. "Stable," he said. "Platelets are low, they're monitoring. Correct words, correct order." I have interviewed hundreds of people in the worst weeks of their lives, and I can tell you that grief does not produce sentences in the correct order. Grief produces fragments. Grief says they told me something about her liver I don't, hold on. Grief loses the thread. Grant Kessler did not lose the thread. I filed it. I walked past him into my sister's room. She was propped up at maybe 30 degrees, an IV in her left hand, a magnesium drip running, a blood pressure cuff cycling every 15 minutes. Her face was puffy in a way that scared me because it wasn't her face. She looked at me and something behind her eyes let go. The same thing that let go when she was 7 years old and came off that bike and looked up and found me already running. "Hey, Joe, hey." Her voice was thin and, "Did you eat?" "That's my sister." Bleeding into herself and worried about my dinner. "Ma." I held her hand until the nurse asked us to step out for a blood draw. Simone kissed her forehead. Grant stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his eyes on the monitor, and I watched him Emma, and I understood something about him in that moment that I could not have put into a sentence yet. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the data about her. At 1:04 a.m. Dr. Beckett came out and gathered us in the hallway. Platelets had dropped to 68,000. Liver enzymes were climbing. She said the words, "We need to deliver this baby," and she said them in a tone that was not a question. And Grant said, "Can we get one more set of labs first?" I turned my head and looked at him. He said it reasonably. He said it the way a good financial advisor asks whether we've considered the tax implications. He said, "I just don't want to rush into a surgery if this is a lab error. That's happened before, right? Contaminated draw?" Dr. Beckett looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "This is not a lab error," and she went back through the door. Later, much later, I would learn that the delay between that exchange and the moment they moved Josie to the OR was 4 minutes and change. 4 minutes is nothing. 4 minutes is how long it takes to lose a set of car keys. I have written accident reports where 4 minutes was the entire difference between everyone walking away and nobody walking away, and I have never once in my professional life been able to make a family understand what 4 minutes can hold. At 1:22 a.m., they took my sister into an operating room. General anesthesia, because her platelets were too low for a spinal. At 1:34 a.m., my nephew was born. 5 pounds, 1 ounce. He came out gray and he came out silent, and 11 seconds later, according to the record, He screamed loud enough that a nurse in the corridor heard him through 2 doors. They took him to the NICU on the 5th floor. They did not take my sister anywhere, because at 1:41 she started bleeding and she did not stop. Nobody told us this. From the waiting area, a room with 4 chairs, a wall-mounted television playing a home renovation show with the sound off, and a coffee machine that dispensed something brown. What we knew was that at some point the corridor changed frequency. That's the only way I can describe it. The corridor changed frequency. Simone gripped my forearm with both hands. The woman arrived at 2:18. She came off the elevator carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place on Abercorn that closes at 10, which meant those cups had been bought hours earlier, which meant she had been awake and near Grant Kessler and holding coffee for a long time before she decided to come upstairs. She was maybe 27. Camel coat. She walked off that elevator and scanned the corridor once and found Grant without hesitating, the way you find someone you've been texting. He came off the wall like it had gotten hot. Simone said very quietly, "Who is that?" I didn't answer. I was working. They spoke near the elevator bank for about 90 seconds. She handed him one of the coffees. He took it. Then he brought her toward us, and he was already talking before he'd covered half the distance, which is a thing people do when they're delivering a line they wrote on the way over. "This is Delaney Pike," he said. We worked together. She was up, she heard. Delaney Pike said she was so sorry. She said it well. Nobody drives to a hospital at 2 in the morning holding coffee for a coworker's wife. I said, "Thank you for coming," and I shook her hand, and I looked at her face and put it in the grid. Simone said, "That's very thoughtful," in a tone that could have stripped paint. They stood off by the window. At one point, Grant's hand went to the small of her back and stayed there for something like a second and a half before he took it away. I breathed in through my nose. I held it. I let it out. I did not do anything, and I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't restraint. It wasn't dignity. It was that my sister was behind a door bleeding, and every ounce of everything I had was pointed at that door. And I understood, in a cold place at the base of my skull, that if I opened my mouth right then, I would lose the ability to observe. And observing was the only thing I could still do for her. So I stood there, and I watched, and I wrote it down in the only place I had. At 3:31 a.m., my sister's heart stopped. I didn't know it. You never know it. What I knew was that the corridor changed frequency again, and this time it kept changing, and a man in scrubs I hadn't seen before came at a jog from the direction of the stairwell, and somebody said a word into a phone that I have decided not to write down. We were told nothing for 26 minutes. I'm not going to tell you about those 26 minutes, not because I can't. Because they belonged to me and to Simone, and to a chapel on the 2nd floor with a laminated card in the pew that had the 23rd Psalm on one side and a phone number on the other, and to whatever it is I was saying to God, with my forehead against the back of the bench in front of me. That conversation is not for a video. It's not for anybody. Simone came and got me at 3:57. At 4:07, Dr. Beckett came through the door. I have delivered news to families. I have knocked on doors at hours when a knock can only mean one thing. I know what the face looks like, the arranged, neutral, held-back face, where you keep everything behind your teeth until the words can carry it. I looked at her, and my knees went to water, because I could not read which way it was going to break. And that's the worst thing about unreadable. It's a mercy, and it's a cruelty in the same expression. She said, "We got her back." I sat down on the floor, not a chair. The floor. 46 years old, a grown man, in a hospital hallway with my back against a wall and my hands over my face. "She's critical," Dr. Beckett said. "She's in the ICU, she's on a ventilator, and she's sedated. We've given 7 units. There's a long way to go. But her heart is beating, and it is beating on its own." Simone made a sound I had never heard from her in 22 years of marriage, and have never heard since. I said, "Can I see her?" "Not yet." I said, the baby is in the NICU on room air, and he is furious about all of it," she said. And for 1/2 second, the doctor's face did something human. "He's fine, he's small, and he's fine." She went back through the door. I stood up. I found the wall. I breathed until my hands stopped shaking. And then I looked down the corridor toward the window and the vending machines. And Grant Kessler was standing there with his phone in his hand. And I want to tell you that at that moment I saw everything clearly, and I understood the shape of what had happened to my family. I didn't. Not yet. I had a bolt with the wrong thread pitch and I hadn't picked it up. But somebody else had. If these stories mean anything to you, the like button and the subscribe button are the whole reason they keep reaching people. Most folks never touch either one. It costs you 2 seconds. It's the only thing keeping this going, and I'm grateful for it. Her name is Yvonne Reyes. She's 51. She's a registered respiratory therapist, and she has worked nights at Chatham Memorial for 17 years, which means she has been in more rooms at the worst moment of those rooms than almost anyone else in that building. Respiratory gets called for everything. When a code runs, she's the one at the head of the bed managing the airway. She was in the OR when my sister's heart stopped, and she was standing 4 feet from her when it started again. I didn't meet Yvonne for 6 days. Everything I'm about to tell you, she told me, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink, and she told it the way people in her line of work tell things. Flat, sequenced, and without a single adjective she couldn't defend. At 3:19 a.m., before the arrest, she was in the corridor outside the OR pulling supplies from the cart. Grant Kessler was maybe 15 feet away by the window. She noticed him because he was the only person on that hallway not moving, and because he was on the phone, and because hospital staff notice who is on the phone. She heard him say, "No, they took her in already." She heard him say, "I don't know. An hour? 2?" She went back into the OR. At 3:53 during the resuscitation, Dr. Beckett stepped out to update the family, and Yvonne was 3 steps behind her carrying a bag of equipment to the elevator. Dr. Beckett told us her heart had stopped and they were working. Yvonne watched Grant Kessler receive that information. This is what she said to me, word for word, at my kitchen table, and I asked her to repeat it, and she did without changing a syllable, which is how I knew she'd said it to herself 100 times already. It didn't move like grief, it moved like arithmetic. She said she'd seen 400 husbands get told. She said grief hits the body before it hits the face. The shoulders go first, the knees, the mouth. She said Grant Kessler's shoulders never moved. His eyes went up and to the left, and stayed there, and something behind his face was working. She delivered the equipment. She came back, and on her way back she took the employee's stairwell instead of the elevator, because the elevator was slow, and the stairwell exits onto the 4th floor next to a fire door with a small wired glass window that looks into the vestibule by the vending machines. At 4:26, 19 minutes after Dr. Beckett told me they'd gotten my sister back, while I was sitting on the floor of a hallway 40 feet away, Yvonne Reyes stood in a stairwell and heard my brother-in-law's voice through a door that had not latched all the way. He said, "If she doesn't wake up, the policy pays out in 90 days. Then he said, "The house is already handled. She signed it in November." A woman's voice said something Yvonne couldn't make out, and Grant said clearly, in the tone of a man reassuring a client about market volatility, "It's not a problem. It's a timeline." Yvonne told me she stood in that stairwell with her hand on the crash bar for a long moment. She said she thought about her own daughter, who is 24. She said she thought about the woman 4 rooms down, who had 31 units of product hanging over her that night, and whose heart she had personally watched stop. Then she went and finished her shift. She charted. She did not say anything to anybody for 6 days. She thought about it every one of those days. She sat in her car in the employee garage after her shift on that Thursday for 22 minutes, keys in her hand, engine off, in the cold. She told me that. She said, "I kept thinking, what if I heard it wrong? What if I'm about to blow up a family over a sentence?" I asked her what changed her mind. She said, "Nothing changed my mind. I just decided I'd rather be wrong out loud than right in private." I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything else in this whole story. But before Yvonne came to my kitchen, before any of that, there was a moment in a 4th floor consultation room at 6:15 in the morning, and it is the moment this entire thing turns on. Dr. Beckett came and found us, Grant and me. Simone had gone up to the NICU to look at the baby through the glass, because somebody in our family needed to look at him and I couldn't stand up. Dr. Beckett walked us into the small room, round table, box of tissues, nothing on the walls. Every hospital in America has that room, and it exists for exactly one purpose. She sat down. She didn't stand. She sat and she folded her hands, and I've thought about that too. That a woman who had been on her feet for 11 hours sat down, so that we wouldn't have to look up at her. She said, "Josie is awake." Grant said, "What?" and started to stand, and she said, "She came off sedation. She's extubated. She's oriented. Her platelets are climbing." A pause. The first thing she asked me was whether the baby was breathing on his own. I put my hand over my mouth. Then Dr. Beckett looked at Grant. She looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to, and she said, quietly, "She asked me to tell you yet. The room you went so still. I could hear the ventilation." Grant sat back down, slowly. "I don't. She's confused. She just came off anesthesia. She's not confused," Dr. Beckett said. I assessed her. She's fully oriented. She was very clear about what she wanted. She stood up. She squared the edge of a folder against the table. She'd like to see her brother. She left. Grant Kessler sat across from me at that little round table, and I watched his face do a thing I have only seen once before in my life. At a poker table in Biloxi 20 years ago, on a man who had pushed everything he owned into the middle of the table on a hand he was certain about. He said, "Wheeze." I said, "Don't." I went and saw my sister. She was gray. Her lips were cracked. There was a tube taped to the side of her neck. She turned her head maybe 15 degrees when I came in, and her eyes found me, and she said in a voice like paper, "Is he really breathing on his own?" "He is. You've seen him?" "Simone has. She says he's mad as hell." Josie closed her eyes, and something in her chest hitched, and I sat down in the chair, not standing over her, sitting, because I have learned that the person sitting beside you when you wake up is telling you with their whole body that you are safe. After a while she said, "I need to tell you some things." I said, "I've got nowhere to be." Here is what my sister told me over the next 2 days, in pieces, between naps, with the door closed. Last November, at 32 weeks pregnant, exhausted, swollen, sleeping 3 hours a night, she came home from a 12-hour shift and found dinner made in a folder on the kitchen table. Grant said it was a refinance. Rates had moved. He'd already talked to the lender. He handed her a pen with the cap already off. She signed 4 pages. She did not read them. I need you to understand that she is not a careless person. She is the most careful person I have ever known. But she'd been on her feet for 12 hours. Her ankles were the size of grapefruits. Her husband had made her dinner, and she was 32 weeks pregnant with his son. That's how it happens. It never happens to stupid people. It happens to tired people who love somebody. 3 weeks later, in December, she was looking through his desk for the homeowner's insurance declaration page. The pediatrician's office needed something, some form, it doesn't matter, and she found the copy of what she'd signed. It wasn't a refinance. It was a quitclaim deed. Our father's house on Bolton Street, the house he bought in 1979 and left to Josie free and clear, because I already had one, and because he knew what he was doing. The deed she signed conveyed the property into joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Grant Kessler and Josie Kessler. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship means that when one owner dies, the other owner takes the whole thing instantly. It doesn't go through probate. It doesn't go into an estate. It doesn't pass to a child. It is the single cleanest way in the state of Georgia to move a house from a dead person to a living one, and there is nothing anybody can do about it afterward. The other thing in that folder was a beneficiary change form for her employer's group life policy. $750,000. She had never signed it. He'd printed it and set it aside. Josie sat on the floor of her husband's office at 35 weeks pregnant with a manila folder in her lap for, she thinks, about 40 minutes. Then she got up. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it. She went into the kitchen and made herself a peanut butter sandwich because the baby was kicking, and she ate the whole thing standing at the counter. And she did not say one word to him. Instead, she called a lawyer, Roselle Marchetti, 62, family law, an office in a converted row house on Whitaker Street, with a dog that sleeps under her desk. Josie found her by calling 3 people she trusted and asking who they'd want if the other side had money and knew how to move it. Roselle explained the arithmetic to her, and I'm going to explain it to you the way Roselle later explained it to me, sitting in that row house, because this is the part that made me put my hand on the arm of the chair. Under Georgia law, an unborn child is not an heir. A child has to be born alive. If Josie had died on that operating table before 1:34 a.m., before that boy took his 11-second pause and then screamed, Grant would have taken the house by survivorship, taken the life insurance by designation, and taken every dollar of her retirement, and he would have done it as a grieving widower with a stillborn son, and not one person on this earth would ever have looked twice at a deed she signed at her own kitchen table 3 months earlier. But if the baby is born alive and lives even a minute longer than his mother, everything changes. The child becomes an heir. The estate has a person in it. A judge gets involved. Grant would control the money only as a court-supervised conservator, filing an annual accounting with the Chatham County Probate Court for 18 years while a judge read every line. Every hour that boy stayed, answered my sister, was an hour the math stayed clean. Can we get one more set of labs first? I have investigated 140 accidents. I have never in my life had a piece of evidence land the way that sentence landed when I finally understood it. I sat in Roselle Marchetti's office, and I had to ask her for a glass of water. Here's what my sister did in December after she put the folder back. Georgia is a one-party consent state. You can legally record a conversation you are part of. Josie, being Josie, read the statute first. Then on December 19th, she asked her husband a leading question at dinner about whether they should update her life insurance now that the baby was coming, and she recorded 11 minutes of his answer, in which he explained to her, patiently and warmly, why it made sense for him to be the sole beneficiary for now, and why they'd revisit it after the baby came, and why she shouldn't mention it to her brother because Wes has opinions about money. Then she filed a petition to set aside the deed on grounds of fraud and undue influence, executed a new will, and, this is the part I love most, this is the part where I know exactly whose daughter she is. She went online, logged into her employer's benefits portal on her lunch break, and changed the beneficiary of a $750,000 policy from Grant Kessler, spouse to the Hollis Bramlett Family Trust, of which her unborn son is the sole beneficiary, and I am the trustee. She never told me. Not one word for 2 months. The confirmation letter went to her work email. She was 35 weeks pregnant and she had already taken the whole hand. I said, "Joe, why didn't you call me?" She looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said, "Because you would have gone over there." She wasn't wrong. She said, "And because Dad always said, don't let a man know what you know until you know all of it." He did say that. He said it about the port, about Foreman, about the union. He said it about crane cables. I said it to her once, on a Tuesday, when she was 14 and somebody at school was lying about her. I sat in that ICU room and I was so proud of her I could not speak, and underneath the pride was a grief so specific it had corners, because a woman does not learn to do that unless she has needed to. Yvonne Reyes came to see her on day 6. She knocked. She introduced herself. Name, department. I was in the room, and she asked how Josie was scheduled. They talked about how the boy had started nursing. Then Yvonne said she had something Josie had a right to know, and she said it plainly, and she got out of the way of it. The stairwell. The door that didn't latch, the policy, 90 days. It's not a problem, it's a timeline. Josie listened without moving. When Yvonne was done, my sister said, "Thank you. I want you to know 2 things. I'm not surprised. And it's already handled." Yvonne told me later that she'd walked into that room braced to catch a woman falling, and instead she found somebody standing on ground she'd poured herself 2 months earlier. She said, "I figured you might be." Roselle Marchetti came on day 7, and I sat in the hall in a plastic chair, holding a magazine I never opened. Available, out of the way. Both at once, which is a thing I have gotten better at. Grant came on day 8. He brought flowers, not gas station flowers. Real ones wrapped in brown paper, the kind you order. And he stood in the doorway of that room, and he looked at his wife in the bed. And then he looked past her, at the isolette they'd wheeled down from the 5th floor for the afternoon, and he saw his son's face for the first time. Something moved across Grant Kessler's expression that I believe was real. I want to say that as clearly as I can, because the easy thing here is to tell you he's a monster all the way through, and if he were, this story wouldn't be worth telling. He stood in that doorway and looked at that baby, and his eyes filled up, and the flowers were real, and the thing in his chest was real. It didn't matter. That's the part I've had to sit with. It didn't change one thing. Sit down. He sat, and she told him what she knew, in order, the way you'd walk somebody through a building that's about to be condemned. The folder in his desk, the date, the name of her attorney, the petition already filed, the recording from December 19th, and what he'd said, and what time he'd said it, and then last, because she'd saved it, a stairwell door at 4:26 in the morning that hadn't latched. He tried a few things. Some of them were apologies. Some were explanations. There was one that started, "You have to understand what that night was like for me." And my sister let him finish it, and then she said quietly, "I was dead for 11 minutes. Tell me more about the night," he said. I panicked. And Josie Bramlett, who was 33 years old and had been alive again for 8 days, looked at her husband and said, "You had that deed drawn up in November. Panic is what you do in a moment. What you did took an appointment." He didn't have anything for that. There isn't anything. He left an hour later. The flowers stayed. She moved them to the windowsill so they'd catch the light. Here's what happened, since I know you want to know, and since the last thing I want to do is tell you a story about a man who does something like this, and then simply walks off into the rest of his life. The petition to set aside the deed went before a judge in the Superior Court of Chatham County in April. Roselle put the recording in front of him, along with the timeline. Deed executed November 14th, drawn up by a title company Grant used for his own clients, signed at a kitchen table with no independent counsel, by a woman 32 weeks pregnant who had worked a 12-hour shift that day. She also put in the fact, which nobody had noticed until she went looking, that Grant Kessler had called the group life insurance carrier twice in January to ask about the payout timeline on a claim. The deed was set aside. The house is Josie's. It was always Josie's. My father's name is back on the chain of title where it belongs. The divorce was finalized in September. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions about how equitable a court found a man who redrew a title in November and priced out a widow's payout in January. Roselle referred the recording and the deed to the Chatham County District Attorney's Office. They looked at it for 11 months. In the end, they declined to prosecute, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't hollow me out for a while. Intent is hard. Nobody dies of a document. But Grant Kessler held a Series 65. He was a registered investment advisor representative, which means he had a fiduciary duty, and it means he answered to the Securities Division of the Georgia Secretary of State's office. Roselle sent them the file. So did Josie's employer's benefits administrator, who had questions of her own about 2 phone calls. His registration was revoked in the spring. It's public. Anybody can look him up. Anybody who ever wants to hand him $1 of their retirement money can type his name into a website and read exactly what a state examiner concluded about his fitness to hold other people's money in trust. He works in commercial insurance sales now, in a different county. He pays child support until the boy is 18. He gets supervised visitation, 4 hours every other Saturday, at a facility on Eisenhower Drive with a waiting room and a window. I've driven her there. Twice. I sat in the truck. The second time, I watched him through the glass, sitting in a molded plastic chair with a 2-year-old on his knee and a caseworker with a clipboard 8 feet away, and I felt something I did not expect and did not want, which was not satisfaction. Delaney Pike left the firm in March. I don't know where she is. I have never wanted to. Yvonne Reyes still works nights. She was at my house for Thanksgiving. She and Simone have a text thread I am not privy to. My sister went back to work last year part-time at first. She keeps the flowers thing going. There are always flowers on that windowsill in the front room on Bolton Street, and she buys them for herself every Friday from the market on Broughton, and I have never once heard her explain why, and I have never once asked. Here's what I carry out of that hospital. I carry a man standing at a window at 4:26 in the morning, running a payout calendar while his wife was being given her 31st unit of blood 40 feet away. I carry that on purpose. I don't set it down, because in my line of work I have learned that the structures that come apart are almost never the ones that looked bad. The bridge that fails is the one that passed inspection. The pilot who kills everybody is the one with the beautiful logbook. The truth is never in the loud part. It's in a bolt with the wrong thread pitch, off at the edge of the grid. In grass nobody bothered to walk. Can we get one more set of labs first? Said reasonably. Said in the correct order. And I carry the other things, which are heavier and which I have to work harder to hold. I carry Yvonne Reyes sitting in a cold car in an employee parking garage for 22 minutes, deciding to be wrong out loud rather than right in private. I carry Dr. Amara Beckett sitting down at a round table instead of standing and looking a man in the eye and saying 9 words she did not have to say. I carry Roselle Marchetti reading a title chain at 11 o'clock at night with a dog asleep under her desk. And I carry my sister, 35 weeks pregnant, sitting on the floor of her husband's office with a manila folder in her lap, putting it back exactly where she found it. She did not learn that from me. Simone says she did. Simone says I taught her to read a room and Dad taught her to keep her mouth shut. And between the two of us we built a woman who could survive being married to Grant Kessler. Maybe. I think we just gave her the ground. She grew the rest of it herself, and I would trade every bit of it. The strength, the composure, all of it. To have a sister who never needed any. His name is Wade. It was our father's middle name. He's 2.5 now. He has Josie's hands and my mother's stubborn chin, and he will not, under any circumstances, wear a hat. Wherever you're listening from tonight, and I mean that, tell me, put your town in the comments, I read them. Go look at the people around you. Not the ones who say the right thing. The ones who do the small thing, at 4 in the morning, when nobody's watching and there's nothing in it for them. Sometimes I think about that ultrasound 20 weeks in. That boy curled up with both hands over his face, refusing to turn, refusing to be photographed, while a tech laughed and said he was hiding. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting for the room to be safe.